afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Shekhar. Let me join Shekhar in welcoming my co-panelists and all of you to this roundup. Over the last 2 days, we've had the opportunity to listen to and read some excellent papers, as well as listen to some very good discussions. For this panel discussion, we have 4 panelists, and I think each of us will speak for about 7-8 minutes. And since most of us have been here during the paper presentation, perhaps it will be useful to not do a summary of the papers, but perhaps focus on the key takeaways and linking the sort of key findings to policy priorities for 2019-24. The panelists don't need an introduction. However, given their areas of interest and past work, I would request Professor Indira Rajaraman to focus on macro issues. Professor Rajneesh can perhaps focus on the external sector. Professor Nirvikar can look at institutions. And Mr. Panda may want to look at governance, polity-related issues. I have missed out some of the papers. For instance, we had papers on urban, rural. We had papers on data issues. So this is not a watertight compartment. Feel free to speak on any of these issues as long as we stick to the time limit. Before I call upon the first panelist, perhaps I thought it will be useful to look at some of the emerging policy directions for 1924 that to me are apparent in the sort of the latest formal public announcement, policy announcement of the government. I'm talking about the budget 1920. Looking at macro, there are clearly, ma'am, issues like the rising interest payment to GDP ratio, the rise in non-interest union government expenditure as a percentage of GDP, and the off-balance sheet borrowings that clearly seem to be growing. So is fiscal consolidation actually happening in the manner that people were hoping, or are there fiscal concerns that we should be worried about? Just a sort of a quick one-line summary of some of the issues that stood out in my consideration. Likewise, on the external front, in the budget we have many announcements. There are clear increases in FDI, FPI, that is the foreign direct investment, and the foreign institutional investment limits. There are other sort of measures to open up, and there is this very important announcement relating to likely foreign borrowing by the sovereign. On the institutional side, perhaps there is an issue which I want to mention, which may not have been noticed. This is an issue which came up for a lot of discussions in the last couple of years. The finance bill, the legislation which contains all of the proposals of the government which would need to be debated and cleared by Parliament, as per something called Article 110 of our Constitution, is classified as a money bill. Money bill has a fairly narrow definition, and it also has clear provisions in terms of the role of the Lok Sabha as opposed to the role of the Rajya Sabha. That is the house that is elected by the people and the house that is an indirect house. Now, in the past, the finance bill typically only contained taxation proposals. Now, this year, we see changes to the Reserve Bank of India Act, changes to the SEBI Acts, all as part of the finance bill. The RBI Act amendments, for instance, deal with the entire housing finance company issues, the non-banking finance company issues, their regulation, their resolution. For instance, in at least one case, there is a departure from this government's own proposal on how do we resolve bankrupt or about to be bankrupt financial companies. There was a bill called the DI, which came a couple of years ago, which went before a standing committee and which is still somewhere in the system. But what has been introduced in the finance bill completely runs contrary to this government's own bill of 2 years ago. That bill would have had to go through the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, but this bill can only be voted upon by the Lok Sabha. Likewise, the amendment to the SEBI Act, which perhaps almost nobody has noticed, takes away the accumulated capital surplus of the SEBI and puts it into the Consolidated Fund of India. So all this debate that is going on the adequacy of the capital framework of the Reserve Bank of India being headed by Dr. Bimal Jalan, in respect of SEBI, has been handled by this budget. And if you go through the finance bill, you won't make one word of sense, because all it says is, in section 15.3, after the word capital surplus, add the word dash. And it's a series of add the word dash. And if you actually add up all the words, the net result is SEBI's surplus is now with the government. I'm not on the merit of the proposal. May be a great idea, may not be a great idea, but I think these are significant but not adequately discussed changes, and which brings me to my last point, which is the area that I'd like Mr. Panda to focus on. In the last year's Roundup, sir, if you recall, you spoke about the importance of labor reforms, judicial reforms, and electoral reforms. And since then, you've made a very important transition. You've substituted the alphabet D with an alphabet P. He has moved from the BJD to the BJP, and he's now part of the ruling government. Now, this transition is a transition to power, and in a sense, governance is at the core of all of what I'm talking about. In fact, I think we are now reaching a situation where you may do all the financial sector reforms that you want, clean up issues in the Reserve Bank of India, NBFC sector. Lending in India will not pick up unless you actually sort out the CBI. If, and just for your information, of the finance secretaries who held office between 2005 and 15, of the 6 of them, 4 of them are currently indicted by the CBI. More than 50% of public sector bank chairmen who held office between 2005 and 15 are now before the CBI, perhaps for good reasons. So, India's economic reforms now actually depend on this side of North Block, not on the finance ministry side, but on the internal security side of North Block. So governance perhaps is now core to India's economic growth far more than economic policy itself. In the light of this, do you have suggestions in terms of what needs to be done? And do you have views on what is likely to be done? And I'd like you to sort of also, if you can, speak about, since you actually made labor reforms the most important sort of desired reform that you would like, do you think what is sort of happening in terms of the national code on wages, and today's paper talks about another national code on safety, are these the beginnings of much needed labor reforms? Can we expect more? We'd be very happy to sort of hear you on all these, sir. With this, I will stop, and if ma'am is ready to go, can we start with you, ma'am? 7 or 8 minutes. And Shekhar, you're keeping time? Or we can't see from here.
Shall I speak from here, or do you want me to go there?
Your convenience.
Okay. If you can see me, I'll just speak from here. Okay. Thank you, Chairman, for giving me 7 to 8 minutes to speak. The job description that you just described for the panelists is slightly different from the job description in the email that you circulated to us, in which you asked that we comment on the 5 papers presented with that subject allocation that you referred to. And the subjects allocated to me were fiscal and macroeconomic. And so I've always been an obedient student. So I focused on the 2 papers, which are in the fiscal and macroeconomics area. One was, of course, the paper by Karthik and Maitreesh Khatak on UBI, which is squarely in the fiscal arena. And the second was the first paper by Jallianwala and Singh on the effect of foreign shocks on the Indian economy. So I'm going to confine myself to these 2 papers and not speak too much on the budget, although I've been writing about it, because that was, as I said, a change in my job description. Okay, and the understanding I had from emails from Shekhar Shah, who's the organizer of this conference, was that he wanted us to confine our thoughts to the policy implications, or policy lessons that can be drawn from the papers presented this year. Now, in terms, the other organizer of this conference, Karthik, is not here. He had to go back to California for a family event. But he listed 3 criteria by which IPF papers could be assessed, I guess, or valued. Do they use state-of-the-art methods? Do they ask relevant questions? And do they present big facts? And I think you'll all agree with me that all the 5 papers presented this year have been truly exceptional and have scored very big on at least 1 and sometimes 2 and in some cases 3 of those criteria. So we really had an incredible choice of papers, and I congratulate Shekhar and Karthik for having selected these, although in one of these cases Karthik selected himself. But, now, let me start with the paper by Karthik and Maitreesh. They're both good friends of mine, but I'm going to criticize the paper. On the UBI, they were recommending the UBI, and Maitreesh, you'll have to take my assessment of the policy impact of the paper, which is that the UBI is not going to happen. It's simply not going to happen. It's a non-starter. Okay. We had a very rich discussion around the UBI, as you know, and it's very clear what the trade-offs are. The trade-offs are between a little for everybody or a little more for a targeted smaller number. So that's the basic trade-off. If you want it to matter, it has to be targeted in some sense so that the amount actually matters. But if you want it to be truly universal, it's going to be so small that it's not going to matter. Something like that. I mean, that is the stark choice that we have. One of the discussants at your presentation suggested that we could have targeting out, sort of voluntary targeting out, as a way by which to achieve targeting. I don't think that'll go very far. I don't think enough people will target out. But I don't see how a targeting in program like the UBI can possibly compete with a program that we already have in place, which is in place and running, and that is NREGA, where you have self-targeting in. How can you improve on self-targeting in of the kind that we have in NREGA? We have NREGA in place. It's been in operation for more than 10 years, 15 years, nearly 15 years. We have a lot of experience with running it. There have been problems, cross-sectionally variable, over time, I think, improved and then maybe declined a little bit. And as an experienced administrator like Mr. K.P. Krishnan will aver, whenever you have a program like this, a very complicated administrative machinery is set up to administer it. And in the case of NREGA, because the Congress government which introduced it was so heavily invested in it, a very careful flow of funds mechanism was set in place, going from the center all the way to local government. And this administrative structure itself was fiscally costly. And there it is in place. So we have this embedded cost in the distribution of the NREGA funds. We have a program which is well understood and well accepted. It's working as a transfer. It's not working very well as a way by which to introduce new assets or build new assets. But this government, in its stated commitments at any rate, is talking about how to improve the assets created under NREGA with this rural employment guarantee. So given that we have this thing in place, we are not choosing between two flying birds. We have one in hand. I just don't see how the UBI can prove itself so superior to something which is in place and running that NREGA could actually be jettisoned in favor of a UBI. And if we don't jettison it, if we don't replace NREGA with UBI, then there just isn't fiscal space for it. So we're talking about, if you want to have fiscal space, you have to have it substitute for something. The most obvious thing for it to substitute is NREGA, and that is just not going to be an efficient substitution. Speaking as economists, the reason why the UBI is so highly thought of, although I'm happy to say that I do have company in the small group that doesn't think well of it, and Rakesh Mohan is one of them, and there must be some, surely, other right-thinking people. The economists recommend the UBI because it's not distortionary. Okay? If you really want to have an efficiency improvement, then you have to have a rupee for rupee displacement of a distortionary subsidy by this non-distortionary UBI. Otherwise, you're not going to be fiscally neutral, and presumably you do want to be fiscally neutral in a fiscally challenged situation. The opening remarks by the chairman spoke about how fiscal consolidation doesn't seem to be happening. So I think anybody seriously recommending UBI has to tell us, has to identify the distortionary elements in the present expenditure package, which can be replaced rupee for rupee by a non-distortionary UBI. They have to speak of how those distortionary expenditures can be weeded out, and whether the political economy of the situation in India will permit that kind of weeding out. So until that is done, at least among the group of economists, I don't see the case for UBI as being at all persuasive, and therefore as having any policy content at all. I'm going to move on to the first paper, which was sensational, I thought, the examination of the impact of foreign shocks. Sensational because it was so carefully done econometrically. I do agree with some of the discussants about the fact that the global risk and the economic policy risk and so on were perhaps not measured very carefully. But then again, when I see papers like this, I'm very happy that those things were attempted because it does teach us a lot. And I don't think the paper should drop those variables at all. I rather liked that attempt, even though these are not measured in the canonical ways that economists measure things. Now, again, I'm going to refer back to an email exchange between, as you can see, we've been very busy emailing one another before this panel, in which, one of the panelists who's going to follow, namely Rajneesh, said that in response to this paper, what he would probably say is that we should improve the market for hedging instruments in India, because so as to hedge against this kind of foreign shocks. Rajneesh, am I representing you correctly?
Yes.
Yeah. So let me tell you what I'm afraid of when I hear things like that. I mean, Rajneesh is perfectly reasonably, it's a perfectly reasonable suggestion for Rajneesh to make. But whenever we make policy recommendations in India, we have to be very, very careful about the institutional limitations in India, which are huge, which are all pervasive. And I'll give you an example of an attempt to make the derivatives market in India more sophisticated, which happened about 12 years ago, which really crashed. And earlier this calendar year, the present RBI governor announced that complex derivative was going to be brought back. And that sent cold shivers down my spine, because I remember what happened 12 years ago. What happened 12 years ago was, if you remember, leading up to the global crisis, there was a capital inflow glut into India. Capital was really flowing in big time, and the rupee was appreciating, and the RBI was trying very hard to prevent the rupee from appreciating. So at that time, exporters who earned their money in dollars, which was depreciating vis-a-vis the Indian rupee, they were looking for ways by which to hedge their earnings so that their earnings wouldn't take a deep dive, because they're being paid in dollars and the dollar is losing value against the rupee. So the RBI, therefore, allowed a market for complex currency derivatives to develop, whereby it was terribly complicated. Okay, it was terribly complicated. The exporter would swap his rupee loan into, let's say, a Swiss franc loan, taking advantage of the low rates on the Swiss franc, pay a big premium upfront, and it was an option. And if the Swiss franc crossed a certain value against the US dollar, then he would have to pay a big penalty to the bank which was arranging this. Very quickly, because I have only a minute left, banks were pushing these kinds of complex derivatives, which the buyers of these derivatives, namely the exporters who were buying them, had no clue about. They didn't understand it at all. But banks were pushing these derivatives because it gave them a big treasury income, because the premium was paid upfront by the exporter. And it's very similar to what happened in the US mortgage market, leading to the global crisis. The participants in the market didn't understand what was going on. They didn't understand the deal they were taking part in. So, and there was a big buying community among garment manufacturers in Tirupur in Tamil Nadu. They crashed. They really crashed. They had to pay big penalties. Some of them paid up the penalties and just closed business. Some of them didn't pay, and the banks sued them, and those cases are still going on in the courts. So what the RBI did in response to that was to close this complex derivatives market, and ever since then we've had only plain vanilla derivatives, okay, single currency derivatives, for hedging. And earlier this year, when the RBI governor said he was going to bring in these complex derivatives again, I thought, oh my God, the financial market at the moment can at best be described as fragile. It's on a very, very fragile footing right now. And what we did not need at this juncture was a reintroduction of these complex derivatives. I'm telling you this story because policy lessons that economists in good faith and in total innocence beam at policymakers in a country like India can be carried to levels that the institutional structure here cannot sustain. I can give you many examples of this. This was just an example related to Rajneesh's comment on one of the papers which fell within my area as assigned to me by the chairman. So to conclude, therefore, whenever we draw policy lessons from any academic research, we have to de-link the quality of the research, which may be exceptionally high, from the policy lesson, which may be unsuitable, to the strength of the patient or receiving this advice. It's rather like a patient in poor health, let's say getting some disease like cancer and being advised chemotherapy when the chemotherapy is not such that his body can actually sustain it. So you have to think about what advice will work in the Indian context. And as I said, about this complex derivatives, the advice I gave to the RBI governor was that he should consult with the present CEA.
Usually over time.
I'm going to conclude this sentence. To consult the present CEA, who is an expert on financial risk, is very well known for his teaching at ISB. And I said, you have a CEA in place. He will advise you. Please listen to his advice. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I ask Professor Mehra to speak, just for the record, ma'am, since you mentioned the email, the plan will be to focus on what the IPF papers this year are telling us and the links with the policy priorities for the 5 years 1924. We have some indication of the unfolding of the GOI thinking on the next 5 years. as contained in the recently released budget documents. So,
That was an earlier email.
no, this is the final email. I'm reading out from the final email just for the record. Government servants get very worried when you say that your email wasn't correct. So that was just for the record. But Rajneesh ji, she has commented already on what you're going to say. So you have the difficult position of defending what you have not even said yet. And therefore, we'll give you 1 extra minute. And Shekhar will start the timing now with the extra minute added.
Chairman Krishnan, may I make a comment on time consistency? She has already been allowed to speak for 15 minutes uninterrupted. And absolutely, and I'm sure DG Shah will be fair enough to allow that same privilege. And so thank you. All right, I was looking around the room, and I had hoped that today there would be 4 people in the audience who were there at the first IPF, which was held in the DG's office upstairs. But during the lunch break, 3 of them absconded, 2 together. Rakesh and Stan went off to lunch, and Pranab is no longer to be found here. So I am the sole surviving person. You were there. Oh, my apologies. So we are there. Okay. Okay. All right. They were shifting to emails. We had 15 minutes, and we had 7 minutes. It was confusing. So I can see, and it was over the weekend. I think we have to be excused for not imbibing each email as that rigorously. But okay, so we started with that assignment, which was what are these IPF papers telling us, and I thought that was pretty straightforward. I mean, you summarize what these papers are. Then the assignment went up exponentially when the task was to tie it with policy priorities for the next 5 years. So let me move on. The 5 papers can be categorized into 3 categories. The first category is the impact of international developments on the Indian economy. The next is measurement of key statistics, then contributions to the literature on inclusive growth, and my comments will take the task seriously and try to link these papers to potential policy initiatives. But before I start, I want to go in chronological order, and I want to make some comments on the CEA's introductory keynote address. He seemed obsessed with dwarves and infant firms, etc. And it occurred to me, I had put my hand up for a question, but he was in a hurry, so he left. Firm size is endogenous. That's not a primitive. And this is a consequence, and we at the IPF have discussed it over years and years and years. It's a question of, I would say, first order is the labor laws in this country, which penalize large firms because the cost of layoffs is so high. So people try to be small. So I just thought I would start with that. Okay. The first paper is a statistical paper. It shows that there is a statistically significant effect of monetary policy shocks, oil, economic policy uncertainty, geopolitical risk on the Indian economy. But if you want to draw any policy implications from that, the authors would have to go one step beyond. This is important to document these facts, as Indira mentioned. But you have to go to an additional step to show that these effects are economically significant. Statistical significance is different from economic significance. And that will necessarily involve a model. You really need a model to address whether something is economically significant. And one example would be in the case of an oil shock, the cost of hedging through storage Derivatives is not, I mean, there are so many techniques for hedging. You could hedge through storage, derivatives, development of alternate technologies, exploration of new resources or sources. And the key thing I want to point out is relative to the cost and the welfare improvements. That, of course, will be model dependent. A commonly used method is to use lifetime consumption equivalents as in Lucas 87, using the no intervention policy as the base. This is the fraction of consumption that would make a household indifferent between the two policies. So that puts a bound on costs that you would incur to implement that intervention. Now, there was one shock that was not addressed in the paper, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip it. It's just that given the structure of the U.S. economy, we're exceedingly, will be exceedingly dependent on the U.S. business cycle. And this will come as a leverage form, especially to business outsourcing thing. This was not discussed, and I don't want to take up too much time because I have other things to say. All right, the next paper, potentially the most interesting piece of work in this conference and will have long-lasting effects were the two papers on documenting anomalies in data and things both. So these were, first of all, what is the relevance to policy? I mean, you cannot have policy without accurate measurement of economic statistics. It's relevant for all policy. And both papers in their own way highlight the problems in generating accurate statistics in India. They critically examine the state of the national accounts, labor market data, and question reliability. That was the key thing there of key estimates. For example, the NSS and census estimates of population are significantly different. Which one do we believe? Both papers are likely to stimulate a lively discussion, and I think these were great papers, but I don't have an expertise to comment on them, so I'll skip. The final two papers are, I view them as a contribution to the literature on inclusive growth. The first paper presents an innovative index 1% growth dividend. It was discussed widely. In fact, my comments are on record here. What I thought was probably missing from there, I'm not going to repeat them here. The second one documents the distributional consequences of the structural change in transitioning from a shrinking agricultural economy to expanding non-agricultural economy. And what intrigued me there, while I was listening about an hour and a half ago, was their finding that while over the period 1983 to 2005, urban and rural consumption converged for the bottom 45th percentile, this whole thing reversed after 2005. So it intrigued me as I was sitting there. So as we are trained to do, you come up with a story. I actually bounced it off Amartya. So why? One possible explanation is the non-inclusive pattern of growth in India. So this is something off the cuff, okay? And it's inconsistent with my story is inconsistent with some of the points in your paper, but it does explain this one. So India is a unique experiment where an economy is urbanizing by transitioning from agriculture to a service economy, by bypassing the manufacturing stage. And the 1 billion plus population can roughly be divided into the illiterate, the semi-literate, and 200 million with the post-secondary education. The current trend in growth through services concentrates the vast majority of the gains in the hands of the urban 200 million people with post-secondary education. This is in sharp contrast to China, where manufacturing plays a major role and the semi-literate also have a share in the gains. And I think that this pattern of growth is creating increasing skewness in wealth distribution with a concomitant implication for social instability. And this is not true only in India. You look at the United States and you see the same pattern. It's not inclusive growth. You have the opioid crisis. You have weird people being elected. All sorts of things, consequences happen. And so, as a result, policies for inclusive growth assumed center stage. And I was a bit worried as to how I would relate these papers to policy. So all through the conference, I may have asked you, what are your top 3 policy priorities for inclusive growth? And these were almost unanimous, making India's labor law markets more inclusive and education skills for the future. I was going to elaborate on that, but I have no time. And of course, my personal view is that there has to be financial inclusion. You have to have mobile banking, fintech, and the like. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Professor Nirvikar Singh.
Really thrilled to be here. Being at IPF is like drinking from a fire hose, and being as part of this panel gives me a chance to try to make sense of it all. So that's what KP Krishnan asked me to talk about: institutions and distributional issues. And I taken a pretty inclusive approach to that topic. So actually, I always start by thinking about, okay, what are we trying to accomplish? And there's been a lot of debate in India about what are objectives. Obviously, we focus a lot on aggregate income growth, but now we're very concerned about the distribution of growth. And I don't want to neglect capabilities and opportunities, even if they don't translate into higher income growth. They can be valued for themselves. And again, one of the things that I think is important for thinking about policy is our mental frameworks, our models. We're used to, as economists, we've been used to working with models of individualistic rationality, but I think the profession has been very good about expanding those frameworks to think about social norms and constraints, psychological complexities. Both of those sometimes get combined as behavioral factors. Institutional structures, political incentives and constraints. And what I've been gratified by is how much all those factors have been creeping into our thinking about what India needs to do. So I also started with, I didn't restrict my attention to just the 5 papers, but also the other sessions. And a couple of things that I thought were nice in the Chief Economic Advisor's presentation was that he brought to the fore the judicial system, which needs attention. And we often focus on the inefficiencies of the judicial system, but I think the distributional impacts of those inefficiencies are also very important. And I think when we think about inclusion and distribution, it's important to understand how some of these so-called non-economic institutions have very major impacts. The CA also, I think, talked about, he used the words which have tended to be absent from Indian policy discourse, like grandfathering, sunset clauses. And he talked about, framing things with cultural resonance. And, there's things about that one might feel a little squeamish about. But on the other hand, if it works, then, and it's done well, it can be helpful. So now, looking at the first paper, so I'm going to give you a very broad brush. External shocks, my takeaway was, okay, it wasn't a structural model, but I'm going to conclude from what I see is that macroeconomic policy in India has been reasonably good. And I think there's lots of other evidence for that. And my policy conclusion is don't break the institutions. And I think that's an important policy priority is if it's not broken, leave it alone. And again, that matters for distribution because high inflation, high variability in high fluctuations in economic activity can be absolutely disastrous for the poor. So then turning to the paper, which I actually like the title, Reframing Income Transfers, rather than Inclusive Gross Dividend, which was part of it. But and I think that's really, again, the value of this paper is not that it's immediately going to lead to a magic policy, but that it really, I think what I liked about the presentation was that it really said, let's think about all these issues. Let's think about trade-offs between public goods and transfers. How does this compare with other transfer schemes? Can this be more feasible than the more expensive universal basic income schemes? And also I think it focuses attention on, again, what is feasible given the governance institutions we have. So I really like this, and I think that, again, this obviously is designed to squarely address a distributional issue in the context of inclusive growth. And I really hope that this leads to some testing and innovation. So there was a session on education, which wasn't a paper, but I thought a very nice panel. And I mean, obviously, education is an urgent priority with massive challenges. We already knew that. What I took from the discussion was that there is a way forward. I mean, you can do something. We know how to proceed. I mean, we seem to have finally figured out that it's not just putting students in the classroom, but also teaching them something so that they come away with some learning. And I thought the emphasis on focusing on first and second class, first and second grade, it's a really good way of thinking about it. Don't try to do everything at once, but start where you can have maybe the biggest impact. So again, I'm not translating this into very specific policy proposals, but giving you my takeaways from the drinking from the fire hose. Data quality, I know nothing about how Indian data is collected. I've always just taken it at face value. And obviously, these were the two most important aspects of data, national income and employment. What could be more important? And obviously, the loss of trust hampers policy design. Even if the data is, even if it's being done well, maybe it has been improved. But if you have a loss of trust, then you really got to address that. But I also think that the deeper problem is the quality of the economic activities being measured. So not just the data quality, but if you remember, what we were often talking about was, economic activities. What firms do and what workers do in firms and so on. And again, I think that focus on enterprise and productive activity is really where policy needs to focus. And maybe the CA, used words which were kind of hokey, dwarves and infants. And certainly, if he was speaking in the US, I would tell him, don't use the first of those words. It would be offensive. But I think the point is that we don't create enough good jobs, high productivity jobs. And I think that's the underlying issue that I think is part. So it's not just the quality of the data, but the quality of the activities that the data is measuring. And that's my policy takeaway from that. And with rural-urban disparities, I think there's been, I thought that was a very nice summary. There's, again, lots of potential data issues there. I think the fact that there's been a lack of uniform improvement is interesting, and one can tease out more there. The fact that education matters, it just reinforces what we all, I think, all believe, that education is important in terms of giving people opportunities and capabilities. So again, I think the deeper issues here from a policy perspective are a lack of agricultural reform and poor urban governance. And I think we often don't pay enough attention to not just whether we're defining cities or not, but how those cities how they're functioning. So just as we have very inefficient firms, we also have very inefficient cities. And those inefficient cities, in fact, lead to inefficient firms because the firms are dealing with bad infrastructure and so on. So I think these are, again, important policy issues which are underlying the papers that were actually presented. So there was no paper on savings and investment, but it came up again in the CA's talk. Kaushik Basu talked about savings and investment, and the aggregate ratios have really regressed. And if you're looking at high growth, this is a first-order problem. And so, though we see the problem at the aggregate level, We really need micro improvements in household savings. That was something that Karthik and Maitrishi's paper talked about. You need investment at various scales, and different issues arise at those different scales, whether it's micro savings or massive infrastructure. And I think here there's a clear connection when you're trying to translate savings into investment. That's where I think you have a huge policy priority. Okay, maybe the CBI matters here, but I think you still have to clean up the financial sector, reform it, and innovate. And that, again, I think is a first order policy priority. Again, it's not one of the papers, but to me that was sort of underlying what we talked about. So I think in a conclusion, in 7 minutes, I can't give you like 1, 2, 3, 4 priorities, though I've tried that sometimes in my op-ed writings. But I think this is a weakness of Indian policymaking, is that we don't have a clear prioritization. We have laundry lists, and sometimes we just need to say, okay, here's the 3, 4 things to focus on. Abhijit Banerjee, when commenting on Karthik and Maitrishi's paper, said the devil is in the details, and that's true of every policy. The devil should be in the details, and it shouldn't be in other places, which I won't describe. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nirvika Singh. Now, can I request Mr. Panda?
Thank you. First of all, apologies for delaying the start of the session a little bit in the beginning. When Shekhar arm-twisted me into coming to this session, he explicitly said that he wanted to put me on the spot because of my new avatar, as he called it. And when Mr. Krishnan, in his introduction, seemed to hint that in my earlier capacity, I would speak my mind and perhaps be, shall we use the word more circumspect or responsible now? Let me say that I'm going to be as candid as I've always been. One anecdote, the new initials actually reflect my own initials. And another anecdote, and few people know this, although I've said this in an interview or two. 22 years ago, when the BJD was formed and I was a founding member, it was actually founded by the BJP as a satellite unit. Those of us who were founding members of the BJD were all on the verge of joining the BJP, and a tactical decision was taken by the BJP leadership of the late 90s that our part of the country wasn't ready for it yet, and that perhaps there would be a merger of the two entities at some point. But life has a way of playing out differently than you plan. But it's full circle, and I have no hesitation, and if you've kept track of my writings, both in my columns and the book that I published earlier this year, I think you would agree that I'm aligned to the work that this government is doing. So, just a quick note on all the papers. Although I would have benefited from being here and listening to the presentation and discussion, I have had a look at them and listened carefully to the comments made in this session. I liked all of them. The first one, I would only want to add one angle to it, that trade wars, international trade wars, are something that may be out of our control, but not necessarily only a threat. Trade wars between other large super economies can sometimes also represent an opportunity for nations like India. And there are specific sectors that have benefited within the last 1 year. On the two papers on income and employment data, I am not technically qualified to comment on them at depth, but I would say two things here. Often, a lot of the debate and the commentary attributes motives when there aren't any. Sometimes, knowing the situation in how institutions have evolved in India, sometimes whether they are goof-ups or sometimes they are behind the curve in representing data as they ought to be, it doesn't require necessarily motives to be involved. But I will say that the suggestions given are sound, I think, and I think they should be taken up. Again, India being what it is, it's not just that just because logical suggestions have been given, they will immediately be adopted. But they're certainly worthy of further consideration and taking up. I thought the paper on UBI and IGD, for a non-economist, non-technical person, it can often be hair-splitting. I have been engaged with UBI for, among Indian politicians, the longest, having first raised the matter in Parliament many years ago and written about it. I don't believe, I agree with you that UBI is going to be happening anytime soon, and an idea of an IGD is still very new, requires discussion. But what is happening is gradually a restructuring of the kind of subsidy regimes we have had. You've seen that in LPG connections, for instance, and you're going to see that in a lot more. Anybody that follows in detail, you'll know that the kerosene subsidy, for instance, in India, is just a massive scam that has been crying out for a long time to be restructured. So I don't think we're going to see a big bang turnaround at any time, but you'll see creeping restructuring of elements that together, if you add up, will lead to some kind of a basic safety net, which may not exactly be a UBI, but serve some elements of that. One comment, though, regarding Ms. Rajaraman's comments regarding NREGA versus UBI. Now, I said this last year, I believe, also. My on-the-ground experience is, yes, NREGA has served a purpose, a good purpose, but at enormous cost. And it is not just the administrative cost being high, it's the huge leakage that doesn't reflect in the data. I mean, it's just a huge con job, and what happens on the ground level, I don't believe anywhere near the adequate required infrastructure is being created by it. And I believe that other ways, certainly including a UBI, would be far more efficient. There's nothing more efficient than delivering cash to a bank account than to go through the rigmarole of what happens on the ground with NREGA. I was very intrigued by that last paper on rural-urban disparities. And although I agree that it reflects the improvement, lessening of the disparity and particularly the education gap, but I think it's happened over a way too long a period. We're talking about decades, and we need much more rapid transformation. I'll come now to some of the issues that I was asked to talk about by the chairperson of this session. Money bills. I've written about this issue before, and I was quite taken aback to find that this was a problem and debate, controversy in the 1950s and in the 1960s. It's not a new thing. We have elements in our system of parliamentary democracy that sometimes bring gridlock to decision making. And it is not a new thing that governments have found within the rules ways of taking advantage of loopholes. As I said, it's happened before. Now, I would rather that we fix the problem differently, which is why I've advocated parliamentary reform. I've advocated reforming the way the Rajya Sabha works. No other really fully established democracy today has an indirectly elected house have a permanent veto over legislation by the house which is elected directly by the people. The Lords changed its rules 50 years ago. Once 100 years ago, again 50 years ago, once more than 100 years ago and again 70 years ago, so that the Lords can only delay bills by the Commons by 1 year and not have a permanent veto. We need similar approaches. The approach in the US was to do away with the Senate being indirectly elected and make it a directly elected house. And so it can have a permanent veto over Congress. But unless we fix these fundamental problems, if you expect governments to govern, you will have to tolerate that they can find legal loopholes within the constraints to push through governance agendas. And I think that's rational. Two more quick things. Yes, labor reforms. I have been passionate about it. Having come from the private sector, I've kept arguing about it including here last year. But even more than labor reform, the more time I spend in politics, I'm coming to the conclusion that even more fundamental are judicial and police reforms. Now, look, we could come up with 100 reforms that India desperately needs, and we could prioritize them slightly differently, depending on what we are talking about. Labor reforms certainly crucial to employment generation, especially in the manufacturing sector. And I think we are finally beginning to see some seriousness, because for the first time, a government is hinting that the 92% of labor who are not in the organized sector might get included in labor laws. Now, if they were to be included under the 200-odd labor laws that we have today, it would be very difficult to manage. And I think this is a way of shining the light on the problem in a much bigger way to get buy-in from many more sectors, including the middle class who employ a lot of unorganized labor, such as domestic labor, to recognize that we must reform these laws. And if we can streamline them into the 4 codes that Nirmala Sitharaman talked about, I think we would make a huge difference. Having said that, I think the bus may have moved on a little bit since the 1970s and 80s, when the opportunities for manufacturing growth were far more. Today, in the day of AI and algorithms, I think the opportunities are less, but nevertheless, we must go ahead and do it, because whatever employment we can generate from streamlining, rationalizing labor laws, we must. 2 more quick points, because I've run out of time. On CBI, yes, I mean, it's a problem that we know. It's related to the overall governance issues, checks and balances and accountability. Now, look, for instance, I was just at a discussion before coming to the session. Last month, 12 IRS officers were compulsorily retired for lack of integrity. Now, these are harsh steps that the government is taking. This also is having a similar effect of getting many people in government to worry that perhaps they will be held wrongly accountable for decisions that they take. But let me tell you, a government like the government of India, to compulsorily retire somebody is not easy. It takes an immense amount of information gathering before that is done. So this house cleaning is needed, and administrative reform needs to happen. One last word is, there's a big scaling up happening of the pilot project of lateral entry, on which I'm a great champion of that. I'm a great champion of getting in people, maybe people in this room, in larger numbers, not just some of their colleagues, to come in, because, and what is being planned now is hundreds of lateral entrants, as opposed to the 10 that happened last year. I'll conclude by saying the following. I think you're going to see a massive shifting of gears of Modi 2.0. A lot of people had a certain kind of hope in Modi 1.0 and did not pay enough attention to the fact that we did not have a majority in the Rajya Sabha. We still don't, but we are almost there. And so I think you can see the kind of gear shifting that's going on, with the kind of commitment being made on infrastructure and on many other aspects. We can talk about that in Q&A, if you will. One final word. If you haven't heard Prime Minister Modi's speech immediately after getting elected to his newly elected MPs, I urge you to do so. Those of you who can understand Hindi, it'll be on YouTube. And if you can't, there are English transcriptions around. I think it's worth listening to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, and thanks to all my panelists. We have about 20 minutes. We conclude at 3:45? Okay, about 20 plus minutes. So now we are open to questions and comments. Please make them not very long, about a minute or two. We'll start with...
Hi, thanks. This is Maithrish Khatter. So I just wanted a quick reaction to one of the panelists' comments on the paper that was presented yesterday. I actually agree with most of her comments because they were really on something else. compared to what we actually presented. So in fact, our premise was that universal basic income in the way that has been proposed is not going to be fiscally feasible, and therefore we were offering a proportional 1% of GDP formula, which is conceptually as well as fiscally and otherwise different. So that's number one. Also, there is no direct substitutability with NREGA. If anything, you can have a base payment coupled with workfare, which would augment people's income levels. And also some of the problems of NREGA were already pointed out, so I will not sort of belabor those, both by the panel and it came up also earlier. And finally, I think where I didn't agree with it, so as I said, that the first comment I agree, but that's not what we were saying, is the fact that it has no chance of taking off, because our starting premise was with the PM Kisan. You already have 0.5% of GDP committed to what is really a direct transfer program, and the sums we are talking about is almost identical to that. So therefore, we do agree that 0.5% and 1% of GDP per capita are not the same, okay? But on the other hand, just to say that it has no chance of taking off seems kind of counterfactual to some of the trends that are already in place. That's all I would want to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Rajeshwari.
I have a couple of questions. So the first question, it's either for Professor Rajaraman or Mr. Jayapanda, it's on the fiscal consolidation point, taking cues from what the chairperson mentioned. So when we look at the Controller General of Accounts numbers, it shows that the total revenue has fallen by about 12%. And we also know that the off-budget borrowing has been increasing significantly over the last 2 or 3 years. And expenditure is sort of managed by, for example, not paying the Food Corporation of India, which is instead borrowing money from the National Small Savings Fund. And so in the context of all these happenings, how relevant is the fiscal deficit number? And is it also connected to why SEBI is now required to transfer surplus funds to the central government? So that's my first question. And the second question is with regard to, again, the money bill and the finance bill now being used to amend the RBI Act. So once the FRDI bill, which has not been tabled and has basically gotten lost somewhere, which would have helped the resolution of the NBFC crisis that's happening in the economy today, that did not happen. Instead, we see that the finance bill is now being used to give powers to the RBI to resolve non-banking finance companies in a situation where the RBI has not managed to resolve the banking crisis. But now the RBI also has a responsibility of resolve the NBFC crisis. So what's the thoughts of the panel on this? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you to all panelists, and really appreciate the comments that you've had on the paper. I just want to add one thing about the thing that you mentioned about, again, as you said, quality of data is of course very important for policy making. The last line which Professor Nirvika Singh mentioned was really nice, that the devil must be in the detail and not elsewhere. But as you would read the paper also, we've basically concentrating on administrative data. Most of our problems are now somewhere or the other related to the MCA. But I just wanted to draw this attention that a large part of our problems are also in surveys. A large part of our GDP comes from estimation. I mean, the estimation comes from data from surveys. Our services sector estimation comes majorly from surveys. And today, as we see, we don't really have that kind of information coming from surveys as it used to be in the previous years. So would just like to have some thoughts about what is the way in which the system is thinking about reforming surveys, or is there any other proposal in some ways to improve the official statistical system? Thank you.
Yeah, Devesh and then Professor Chadda.
This is a question like to Mr. Panda with regard to your comments on trade. Last 6 years, India's exports have been basically flat. You said that there might be opportunities because of the US-China trade wars, but the evidence is overwhelming that companies are relocating from China but they are relocating to Vietnam, Bangladesh, Cambodia, but not to India. What does it speak to our competitiveness, and what do you think we should do that if firms are so much willing to go to Vietnam and Bangladesh, which are much smaller markets, and not willing to come to India?
Yeah. Do you have a mic?
Yeah. My name tag is not there, but I am Rajesh Chadda from NCAER. First of all, Indira and Professor Mehra, I was also there in the first conference where Bob Lawrence and I had presented a paper on, a very friendly paper on US-India bilateral trade agreement. And today, I think what I'll carry forward from where Devesh has left, that when we are talking about the foreign shocks, since we are commenting on the papers, instead of the monetary policy of the US, one of the most important things is the trade policy that US has adopted, and more recently when it is raising the tariffs. So one of the important shocks that India would need to counter is the US trade policy, and also to think about how to respond to it, whether to kind of raise tariffs on our own or keep them where they are or lower them. So we've been working on some such thoughts. So I thought just to add to one of the papers, I should mention this.
Thank you, Professor Chadda. Dilip?
So it's a question for Mr. Panda about the economic statistics, the papers that we have heard and the various discussions, both formal and informal. I certainly am surprised by what seems to be a serious institutional problem of lack of transparency and lack of credibility of government statistics, which seems to be very recent, as well as potential lack of autonomy for what used to be relatively independent institutions, the National Statistical Commission, the Reserve Bank of India. I'm just wondering whether the government is aware of this issue and what it plans to do to address it.
Thank you. I don't see any more hands at this stage. So maybe we can go in the same order. Can I request Madam Professor Rajaraman to start and then this?
Not many questions addressed to me, actually. Most of them were to J. Panda. Would you like to go first? Yeah, I will, certainly, but lots of questions.
Fine. Thank you. First, I won't be able to address the specific issue of payments to FCI, but when it comes to fiscal responsibility, I think the general impression is that the government has managed the deficit better than what has traditionally been the case. And these sort of individual accounting issues have always existed, and that's why I don't want to go into any specific one. I'm aware that there is a body of work challenging the fisc and saying it's something higher than what is projected. But I'm also under the impression that if you do apples to apples comparison, whatever number that you peg it at today represents a decrease from what has been the case over the past decade. That's my impression. Now, regarding RBI and NBFC, now, irrespective of how the RBI has performed in handling NPAs, my gut feel as a layperson, I'm not an economist, is that RBI ought to be the right institution to handle NBFCs.
The question is not regulating NBFCs.
No, the mess.
Dissolution.
Yes.
Dissolution. This specific provision is on when you have a bankrupt firm, we now have an IBC code and we have a hierarchy. The FRDI bill dealt with how do we resolve failed financial firms, and the FRDI bill had created a whole new structure.
I understand.
Yeah.
Now,
So,
my point is,
I think your question
yes,
is
my point is, my gut feel still is that the RBI ought to be the rightful body to oversee, if it's going to be the regulatory body for banks and bank-like organizations, my gut feel tells me it should be the right body to decide whether they ought to exist or be dissolved. Now, the bankruptcy code and the NCLT, which is operating for normal companies, is already backlogged within just 2 years. And we need to allocate a lot more resources to it. But But I think this is a philosophical discussion that doesn't necessarily have a right answer, one way or another. Now, to come to Devesh's questions, I'm aware of the phenomenon that as China stagnates or peaks, many companies are moving away. The way we would get them to come to India is to obviously make ourselves more attractive on a slew of things. So one area that we are getting very attractive is infrastructure. There's been a dramatic improvement in infrastructure over the past decade, but particularly over the last 5 years. I like touting a particular number that came out in the economic survey, that of the 132,000 kilometers of highways that exists in India today, fully 20%, one of 5 kilometers, was built in the last 4 years. And the pace at which rural roads are being built is transforming the situation. Now, the same can't be said, for example, labor laws. The same can't be said for some other regulatory issues, and we do need to address them. And I believe we will address them. If you look at FDI, we continue to have a very healthy inflow coming in to the country. But it's also not totally unreasonable that smaller countries are more nimble and fix some of these issues faster. And the way India is structured, I think it's understandable that it's taking us time to fix some of these other issues, but I believe we can fix them and we will fix them. And I'm sorry, I missed that last question.
About lack of transparency, credibility on the statistical system as well as institutions. Is that right?
Yes, so I think that's an issue that we've discussed in the context of the 2 papers that have been presented. If I want to play devil's advocate, I could say that China has done just fine while having all these questions for the last 30 years. But I won't be glib, and I will say that I think we ought to seriously take the suggestions and the recommendations made in these 2 papers and implement some, if not all of them. Thanks.
Maitrish, on the UBI, I don't want to be at war with you, but I think you will agree fundamentally that with a UBI, whether it is quantified as 1% of GDP or whatever, or an absolute payment or whatever it is, there is a trade-off between a small payment to everybody, including Ambani, and a smaller and a much larger payment to a targeted number, however that targeting happens. Okay, so we agree on that. That's fundamental, right? You give a little bit to everybody, sure, or you give a lot more to a chosen number. The question then arises, what is the principle on the basis of which that choice is made? Now, I think it was Abhijit Banerjee who, when he spoke as a discussant at your session, suggested that you could have targeting out, just like in the LPG case, the people voluntarily opt out of that subsidy. But you're not going to have a substantial opting out. And people will just, it's going to roll into their bank accounts. Why are they going to opt out of some money that's just going to roll in? So you have to then think of targeting in. And targeting in was a huge problem which was solved by NREGA. So let me, and then you mentioned the PM Kisan also. So let me go into that, okay? So you're saying your 1% basic payment doesn't have to supplant NREGA, it can live in conjunction with that, and Mr. Panda also has spoken of the many failings of NREGA. Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm in a room full of economists. I think a lot of academic work has been done on NREGA, and by and large my sense is that notwithstanding all the problems with it that Mr. Panda mentioned, the leakage and so on, that it has substantially improved incomes. It has been an income supplement at the lowest level, which is where it matters, simply because it is self-targeted. So when you have a self-targeted program in place with an accompanying institutional structure, in a country where it's very difficult to get anything like that put in place unless it has the political leadership standing behind it, which did happen when the Congress was in power, because they saw this as their route to getting re-elected. And the brilliant thing about it was that NREGA was potentially universal, in the sense that you and I could join that workfare program if we were willing to dig the ground or dig a well or something like that. It was open to, I mean, if you're a rural resident. But the point was that the self-targeting nature of it made a potentially universal program fiscally manageable. Okay? And the PM Kisan that you mentioned, what drove that was, even though it was, I mean, it was directed at a very peculiar form of targeting to farmers who are owners of their land. These are not the poorest people in rural areas. The poorest people are landless. And it was directed at this group because they had promise of being electorally powerful. So I'm sure we agree on these fundamentals. And if you want to retain the hope that UBI will come in, I don't want to destroy that hope, but I really do think that UBI is a non-starter and that we need to fix many, many things before we think in terms of a UBI. UBI has become a sort of fashionable thing internationally, and this is, I keep getting back to that. In India, we try to do fashionable things because they are fashionable. We want to shine in the community of nations, but we have to remember our own failings and remember that our institutions are weak. And I do share with Dilip Mukherjee my deep concern about the weakening of institutions which is happening. So let us hope that the government with its new mandate will feel so strong that it will want to strengthen institutions. On Rajeshwari's question on fiscal consolidation, I've written on this issue. The fiscal deficit is supposed to go down to 3.3% this year. It's budgeted at 3.3. It is not likely to do that. I totally agree with you that a number of ways, including delayed payments and so on, have been used in order to keep the reported fiscal deficit at what was targeted in the FRBM Act. Revenue has fallen. Extra budgetary borrowing has increased. I've written about this. The case about the National Small Savings Fund, I've written in detail about how this followed from the 14th Finance Commission recommendations and so on. These institutional details will bore those of us in this room who are from abroad and don't understand what is going on. But the point at issue which Rajeshwari has raised is that we are fiscally challenged at this point. And that relates back to my earlier statement saying that the UBI is a non-starter. This is not a fiscal position from which we can take on something like a UBI. We have to set our fiscal house in order. And there is a last plea that I want to address to Mr. Panda, simply because in my everyday life I never get to have a conversation with someone in the political firmament. I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong, but my sense is that anybody today who says something critical about government policy, not because they are malevolently inclined, but simply because they want their country to do better, they are called anti-national. Okay? Now, that is distressing, deeply distressing, because they might be more nationally inclined than people who praise the government. Okay? Let's not forget King Lear. Okay? There is, you have to be critical of people who praise you. And you should not condemn people who criticize you. And I don't mean you in particular, I mean the government. So that is my plea. I think people should feel free to criticize a policy as long as they have substance to their criticism. And no ascription should be assigned to these people who criticize that they are mouthpiece of the opposition. There is no opposition now anyway, right? So they can't be motivated by a non-existent opposition. So let us say that they are motivated by their own conscience. And critics of the government it has to be assumed, are as desirous of the nation doing well as the government itself. So I would be very, very happy if the Prime Minister or one of the spokespersons of the party were to come out and say, criticize us. We want criticism.
He has actually. That's why I asked you to listen to that speech.
Okay.
Do you want to come in, either of you? Quick 1 minute each.
There was nothing addressed to me, and Mr. Chadda, I apologize. You were there, and I clearly remember your paper.
On the statistical issues, services, data, any quick response?
No, I don't think there was any question for me. And
Comment really on institutions.
yeah, no, I think that was relating to a remark. No, this was a fantastic IPF. Thank you so much, Shekhar.
Time to conclude? Yeah.
May I have 30 seconds?
Oh, please,
1 minute.
More.
Let me take maybe up to a minute and just respond to what Ms. Rajaraman just said. Now, I think it's a valid question, but I will try to refute it. I did ask you to listen to the Prime Minister's speech because he very specifically has said exactly what you are talking about. I do urge you to listen to it. I will also say the following. There is much talk about damaging institutions, but there may be an odd case where something is wrong. But I want to cite 2 examples and say how this is being, this clarion call is being misused. The Nehru Center is headed by somebody I consider one of the finest former officers of the administrative service who served in Prime Minister Vajpayee's office. He happens not to be from the milieu that ran such institutions for many decades and has been unfairly targeted as destroying an institution. I urge you to look into this case and go into the details. I urge you to visit the Nehru Center, decide for yourself if it is being damaged. Nothing could be further from the truth. Today, there's another such accusation in the media. There is a Jallianwala Bagh memorial, and in the establishment that prevailed for many decades, in its wisdom decided that the then ruling party should be, the head of the then ruling party should be a permanent trustee of that institution. It's a political party which is today not the ruling party and a much reduced opposition party. Why should any political party have a special privilege over any other political party in national institutions? I mean, specifically by writing in its constitution to just remove that wording and to say that any eminent person from a political party can be a trustee is being portrayed as a damage to that institution. Now, I urge people to inquire into each one of these cases, and you'll find that in the vast majority, it's just an emotional reaction. But if you rationally look into it, you'll see that there is no such great massive agenda to damage institutions. I could talk at length about RBI, but I think we've run out of time. We can do that over coffee. Thank you.
Exactly 1 minute.
Exactly 1 minute. Just to prove that I don't have an axe to grind, there is one respect in which I'm actually quite impressed. There were 2 policies, the demonetization and GST in the previous government, which were problematic. And when I did an analysis of questions asked in Parliament, I found that, at least in respect of the GST, the probability of a party member, a BJP party member asking a question, normalized of course by their strength in the House, was about the same as that of an opposition member asking the question. And I was impressed by that. The second thing I want to point out very quickly, if I may, is that the Minister of State in the Finance Ministry now, Anurag Singh Thakur, he asked the largest number of questions, some of them quite challenging about demonetization in the previous parliament. So there is evidence that criticism from within the party is not penalized. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I request you all to join me in giving our panel a big applause and conclude with that? Shekhar, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Krishnan, Jai, Indira, Rajneesh, Nirvikar. This was a wonderful ending to, I think, 2 days of what I felt was one of the better IPFs. And it's wonderful that we've had it in our own little auditorium. I want to thank everybody for coming. This has been an exciting 2 days, starting, of course, on Monday with the first T.N. Srinivasan Memorial Lecture. I do want to record my sense of something missing, which is, of course, T.N. and his sharp, pointed, always logical comments that we had got so used to. And I certainly missed that this time. With that, let me invite you all to some tea and coffee. I believe the match is on, and so those of you, including Amartya, will have a full screen viewing of it, either here or in the lobby, so you might partake of that as well. The next IPF will be in July next year. We've traditionally always done the second Tuesday of the year, and we'll be in touch. For the authors, I will be sending out, Karthik and I will be sending out comments. Just a small bit of administrative work. We transcribe everything, so you'll get a full transcription of your session, which will be very valuable in terms of thinking about comments. There'll also be links to the full video of the session, so you can even catch the inflections and the body language if you want to interpret that in terms of what was significant and what was not, and at what confidence level. So those will all be aids that will be available to you. Our endeavor this year is going to be to try and get the volume out by December 31st, which is eminently doable with a 6-month, 5-month advance notice. So we'll have to hustle along and move things, but I'm sure we will be able to. So again, thank you all for coming. It's been wonderful. We're so glad to be able to have done it at NCER finally, and we'll look forward to seeing you next year. Thank you all. And before I end, and before you leave, I have to thank a wonderful crew at NCER. They're not all here, I'm afraid. They're off busy doing things, but I see 1 or 2 representatives. Sudesh Pala, Namrata Ramachandran, Khushi Kaur, Sangeeta Chaudhary, Shilpi Tripathi, Meera Krishnan, and a whole range of other staff at NCER who really worked very, very hard. And I'm really proud of them, and just give them a very big hand.